Hello, I'm Julianne Moore, and I am the author of the Freckle-Faced Strawberry series. The first book is called Freckle-Faced Strawberry, the second, Freckle-Faced Strawberry and the Dodgeball Bully, and the third book, Freckle-Faced Strawberry, Best Friends Forever. And I'm very happy to be here at Reading Rockets to talk about them. When I was growing up, I'm huge readers. My mother, we moved a lot because my father was in the military, and our first stop when we got to a town was to the local library, and we would go every week and we would check out books, and we'd read those books, return them the next week, and that was a major pastime for us. And for me in particular, it was something that I loved, and that was really my constant friend and companion. These books were, what I turned to. I wouldn't know anybody in a town, but I could always go to the library and check out as many books as I wanted to. So that was really what sustained me as a kid through all these moves. And I can remember my mother teaching me to read. When I grew up, we didn't go to preschool. So you spent all those years at home with your mom, and she was the one that went through everything with us. And I can remember the first sentence that I read in this little children's science textbook that said, "Mother, mother," said Bob, "I see a robin." And that I remember sitting next to her, I remember saying the sentence and feeling so accomplished, and thinking the book was so difficult. And but so reading was a big part of my life. Interestingly enough, and in terms of storytelling, my mother was a psychiatric social worker, and my father was a judge in the military. After Vietnam, he became an attorney and then a judge. And so a lot of dinner table conversation was really about behavior, and which of course is really storytelling. So my mother would talk about the family she was treating and what was going on in that family. My father would talk about the cases that he'd seen, and we'd go around the room and talk about what had happened at school that day. But all of it was very much personal narrative, and that's what interested me in novels as well too. It was really I wasn't much of an adventure story reader or a fantasy story reader. I really liked stories about kids, children, young women, and what they were trying to learn or accomplish or do. Books like the Little House books or Anne of Green Gables or Wrinkle in Time, and they all had very kind of interesting, strong, self-determined young heroines in them. I had a teacher in the 5th grade in Alaska. His name was Mr. Jennis, and it was his first year of teaching. And I actually even mentioned to him in an interview years and years ago, said something about how much I had loved being in his class, and got a letter back from him through, I don't know, and he didn't remember me. And was very embarrassed. And I said, listen, I wrote him back. It was his very first year teaching. It was Juneau, Alaska. He's now principal of a school, I think in Anchorage or Fairbanks, I believe he said. But he had a great passion for teaching. He was very young. He was probably 23 or 24 years old. We thought he was so grown up, but he was just a kid. And he read A Wrinkle in Time to us that year. I remember when he would read it chapter by chapter. We could do quiet work while he read. I chose to knit a scarf that I still have. And I loved the book. It was such a beautiful story and so emotional, and so much about the possibility that a child has within themselves to save the world, really. And it was a great year in school, because 5th grade you're sort of starting to become a real student. He encouraged us to think for ourselves. He asked us what we wanted to, what problems we wanted to solve in the world, what did we want to know about, how would we go about doing it. He allowed us to argue. I can remember arguing with him that the Burlington-Bristol Bridge was directly across from Philadelphia, because that was how I remembered it. Because my grandparents lived in New Jersey, and I thought that bridge went straight to Philadelphia, and I was adamant about it. And he kept arguing that no, in fact, it didn't go there. But I still remember the argument, and he took me very seriously, maybe because he was very close to my age. But anyway, he was really a remarkable teacher, and he was probably my first male teacher as well. So I'm sure that was pretty influential. But I had there were so many. I can remember Mrs. Nietenstein in the 2nd grade, and Mrs. Bevins in the 3rd grade, and Mr. Bruni in the 6th grade, the first person who asked us to write a term paper. I'm sure I hope the teachers know how influential they are and how much we remember them years later. you know, and I see it now with my children's teachers, how meaningful they are to them and how much they have to do with their personal and intellectual growth. But it really is kind of amazing what a difference it makes. School was interesting growing up because the kind of school you were in really depended on the county. You know, certainly if you were in a military school, it had to do with what was going on that base, but in the American United States school system, whether or not your school was a good one or a bad one had to do with what the tax bracket was of that particular county you lived in. So because we moved around, sometimes we'd be in a really terrific school system like in Fairfax County or Westchester County, and there were other times we'd be in places where they, you know, weren't quite keeping up just because of the population. I mean, it's an interesting thing for me because I work with Save the Children on U.S. programs, which really is about trying to fix the disparity in U.S. education. The fact that they're huge, you know, we're all promised the same education, but we don't receive it. And it's something that I saw firsthand growing up, you know, going from a school where everybody was excelling and thriving to a school where maybe there wasn't quite enough money for supplies, there weren't as many teachers, there was overcrowding. And so this was happening when I was growing up, so you can imagine what, you know, what's happening now in our school system. Basically, what Save the Children does in U.S. programs is go into areas where there's not enough support economically and offer support to the area in terms of employment and preschool programs and after-school programs and literacy enrichment and book donation. And often, too, in some of these very rural communities, the school system is the major source of employment as well. So you're also giving people jobs within that community. And then I founded a Valentine's Day program a few years ago that was really, I was very influenced by UNICEF, actually, the Trick or Treat for UNICEF, that's about kids helping kids here in the United States, to raise awareness of poverty and that disparity in education right here. And, you know, by talking about poverty and having these Valentine's Day cards, and then also by, you know, it's a huge kids holiday. You always have to buy the Valentines. You may as well buy something where the money is going to help other children in the United States. Writing was something that I never even ever imagined that I'd do, and I had a friend who worked in the book business actually who said to me, you know what you should do? You should write a children's book about your own childhood, something that happened to you. Your kids would love that. And at the time, he didn't have children, and I laughed at him and I said, children don't care about anything that happened to you. You know, they care about what's happening with them. And so I kind of dismissed the idea. But my son was 7 at the time. He's now 13. And that's sort of the moment when children first start noticing what their physicality and that they're different from people around them. And he was very worried about his teeth. His teeth were coming in and he thought they were too big for his face. And he didn't like his haircut. And he didn't like his school picture, and it broke my heart. You know, I just couldn't believe it because he was the most beautiful boy. But then I remembered when I was 7, the same age, that was really when I first noticed my freckles and started hating them. Before, they just didn't matter to me. And there were kids in the neighborhood who called me Freckle-Faced Strawberry because that was the name of a powdered drink mix like Kool-Aid. So there was like Rootin' Tootin' Raspberry and Blueberry Blast and Freckle-Faced Strawberry. So I sort of started with that idea, just about not liking something about yourself. And I think that in a lot of children's literature, especially the classics, there's something that a child doesn't like, but then they grow up and they're transformed and they're beautiful and they no longer resemble the lump that they were. But of course, that's not how it goes in real life. Really what happens is that, you know, you have these freckles and stuff, and you grow up and you still have the freckles and you still don't like them, but it doesn't matter so much. So I wanted to write a story about how the things that loom large in childhood are less important when you grow up. There were a lot of places that I lived where there were no redheads and there were no freckled people, and people were like, what are you and why do you look that way? And it wasn't really until I spent time in areas where there are lots of Scottish and Irish people and was able to see like, oh, there are lots of people who look like me. But it was a very, all the kids would be tan and they all had dark hair or blonde hair. And so to see, to look like I did was to look, super different in certain areas of the country. the thing that I wanted to communicate most is the literalness of childhood. That idea, the magical sense that if you put a hat on your head, you believe yourself to have disappeared. If you're playing a monster, you think you are scary. You've become a monster. The idea in Dodgeball that Freckleface can turn herself into a monster and therefore protect herself, and then inadvertently scare another child, scare a child that seems impervious to fear of any kind, who seems like a tough kid, So. I like that exchange too, that he's able to say to her, "Hey, you're scary," and she has to say, "Hey, I didn't mean to scare you. I'm pretending," So that idea that once again, it's about the largeness of it all, of the things that we might dismiss as growing up, saying, "Oh, please, it's that's just pretend. Don't worry about it." And yet, everything in their world is pretend. It's meaningful to them. So that's kind of So it was really about, for me, growing up and being someone who read constantly and sometimes wouldn't be able to tell the difference between what was happening in my book and what was happening in my life, because I'd get too wrapped up in it and start to feel upset and anxious because whatever, Laura Ingalls Wilder was going through in her book, that they're in the middle of the long winter and they're twisting hay or whatever, and then I'd be like, put the book down and feel like, why am I so upset? So kids can, that kind of emotional influence, I think, is really interesting to me. My mother was from Scotland, and I couldn't hear it because I heard her voice every day, but she had an accent. So when I was little and I'd bring people home, they'd say, "Why does your mom talk so funny?" There was all this sort of like general, my mother would open her mouth and they'd all look at each other and then they'd say, why, what is that? No one had heard a Scottish accent. And of course I would get really infuriated and embarrassed and say it's an accent, and she doesn't have an accent, because like I said, I couldn't quite hear it. That was the thing. That was interesting about it. That was just how my mother spoke. And then later on, when I was in speech class, when I was in college, I have a pretty flat, neutral accent, except for some of there were a few sounds that the teacher was trying to figure out. She's like, "I don't understand why you're making these sounds, and where are you from?" And I told her, and then I said my mother was from Scotland, but she had lost her accent, and she said, "That's what it is. You've based your speech on someone who had an accent, and as she got older, she lost the accent, had an accent and lost it." So we're so, we're even though we're sort of we model ourselves apart from another culture, we're so heavily influenced by that culture simply because we're living with it. And the case that I was actually modeled on my mother's changed speech. That was what was really kind of complicated about it. I actually have a book with Chronicle right now called My Mom is a Foreigner. Basically about, I grew up with a mother who was from Scotland, who came to this country when she was 10 years old. And one of the things that I know lots of other women too who have mothers from Poland or Russia or Puerto Rico or somewhere that was considered different, and that idea of like, what's it like to be first generation in a country that's all about that, and where we think it's our past, but it's in the United States, it's always evolving. There are people coming all the time. So sometimes I'll even talk to an adult woman now, and I think there's something about her. I can't put my finger on it. And then she'll say, "Oh, here's my her mother who's Hungarian." I'm like, "Oh, your mom's a foreigner." That's what it is. So it's really about children talking about what it is to have a parent from another country, and all of the things that you grow up with, and the things that you like, and the things that are difficult for you, and language differences. And so that idea of your mom being somehow strange to everybody else, but to you, she's just your mother. So that's the next thing I'm working on. That sounds very. It still happens to me when I read, where I lose myself in it and I don't know what the reality is, whether it's my reality or their reality. And frankly, that's what actors do. And I always tell everybody this, that just like I didn't intend to be a writer, I didn't intend to be an actor, and was just a kid who read a lot, and then when you were asked to read aloud in class, I just had a facility for it. I felt like I could hear it. Like I could hear the voices in the book, and it was just there on the page. And I thought everybody was that way. And so when I started doing, after-school plays, it was just like reading a book. So for me, even now, when I'm working on a movie, acting is the closest thing I could find to being in a story. So I consider myself, I don't consider myself a performer at all. I don't actually enjoy it. I don't like public speaking. I don't like anything that's performance oriented. I like acting because I want to be in the book. So I still want to pretend and be in here. In performing, there's an acknowledgement that there's a reality outside of what you're doing, that there's an audience watching. And in a lot of the acting that I do, I don't want to acknowledge it. I only want to acknowledge the story. I worked with the playwright David Hare on a couple of things, in a movie and on a play, and he doesn't carry a cell phone with him or iPhone or any kind of device, because he said that he uses the time to wander around, just walking from place to place, to dream about things and think about his work. And he said, and that's where he finds his ideas. And I kind of loved it, because I thought, that's, I'll do that too, working on a movie or working on a book, that I'll go for a long walk or a hike or something and try to just not let any other thoughts come in and see what I come up with. Because it is difficult. I see that with my children too. They come with a homework assignment, and they have to. My son had to write a story the other night, and he did it beautifully, where he had to use all his vocabulary words. He had to use foreshadowing. He had to use a simile. He had all these things that he had to put into a creative story that was only supposed to be 300 words. And I was like, wow, he accomplished it. But it was a big task that we don't ask grown-ups to do very often. I'm certainly never asked to do something like that. My daughter had a homework assignment over the summer where they were supposed to read 2 books, then choose 1 book and write a book jacket. And do an illustration in the front, do a plot summary, write about the author. She was very daunted by this. She's going to the 4th grade, and we, after arguing a little bit, going back and forth, I said, well, let's learn about the author. What do you know about the author? And she's like, I don't know anything about the author. I said, okay, well, let's look her up on the internet, because of course every author these days has a web page, and there was a great and very entertaining description of this author's life, and we read it together, and I said, okay, what do you remember? And she's like, well, she's from New York City. And I said, yeah, she's from New York City. She started writing when she was, a little kid, yeah. She stopped when she had kids, so she basically heard the story and then was able to do it. And she was like, is that it? I'm like, that's it. That's what you did. You did research, and then you wrote about what you learned, not using their words. And so it's interesting. You think, well, how do you find a way to simplify it for children so that it doesn't seem like these words all come from heaven or something? They just come from people, and that they can do it. I talk about that when I talk to little kids about. I said, you can write a book yourself and do your own pictures, or you can do what I did. You can do, the words and have a friend do the pictures, and then you put them in the, and I said, that's it. That's all it is. At home, it's just, it's no one's interested in their parents' work. Nobody cares. But I do think that they're influenced by the fact that I've written these, and their father is a writer, and they both like to write things. They'll both, Liv sometimes says, she goes, sometimes I sit down to write and I can't stop. And I'm like, that's such a great thing to hear. Well, especially with computers these days, I think kids feel this sort of like, well, I could just keep going and going and going, and it's a nice thing to see. I'm Julianne Moore. This is my new book, Freckle-Faced Strawberry, Best Friends Forever. It's the 3rd book in the Freckle-Faced Strawberry series, and I'm going to read a little bit of it. Once, Freckle-Faced Strawberry had a best friend. They were very much alike. That's why they were friends. They were both unusual sizes, too big, too little. They both had nicknames at school. My name is Helen, but they call me Freckle-Faced Strawberry because of my hair and all these freckles. Oh, my name is Windy Pants because of the wind in my... Never mind. They both had families. I have a mom and a dad and a sister and a brother. I have 2 moms and a little brother and a dog. They both love to read. And you'll notice one Freckle-Faced Strawberry is reading Girls Rock Out, and Windy Pants Patrick is reading Rockets. They both like lunch, only not in the cafeteria. I'll have a hot dog, please. May I have a falafel? They both love to play, and they both loved trips to the museum. But Freckleface likes dinosaur, and Windy Pants likes art. They stuck up for each other. They were best friends forever, all the time. Hey, watch out for my friend, she's little. Make way for the big guy, he needs some room. Until one day, who is that girl? Why do you play with her? She's a girl, and girls can't play with us. Aw, she's all right. She's just not good at sports, but she can play other things. Exactly. Why would you want to play other things? Windy Pants Patrick did not think the boy was right, but he didn't play with Freckle-Faced Strawberry at recess. So Freckle-Faced Strawberry watched Windy Pants play ball with the boys. She played Jungle Gym monkeys with the rest of the girls. Boys stink. I don't know why you play with Patrick. You know why they call him Windy Pants, don't you? Besides, he only loves to play ball. That's not true. He loves to read and eat lunch, and we both have nicknames. But Freckleface did not wait for Windy Pants after school that day. The next day, Windy Pants played with the boys, and Freckleface played with the girls. It's not so bad. There are girls who like lunch and like to read. Besides, Windy and I are too different. This is so much better. I don't have to bend down to talk to a short person. I don't have to play Scary Monster ever again. Those other kids are right. And so they did all the regular stuff that kids do. Freckle-Faced Strawberry kept going to the museum. She's looking at art like Windy Pants likes. Windy Pants Patrick kept reading books, and he's reading Girls Rock Out. This book is so good. It's about this girl who's really funny, talks kind of crazy, and they both kept eating lunch. What's the matter, honey? Why aren't you eating? But it wasn't the same. Until one day, Freckle-Faced Strawberry was on the playground looking for a game of ball. She couldn't find any kids, just one big kid playing Monster. Hey, kid, want to play some ball? No, thanks. I'm pretending to be a monster. I have an idea. We could be monsters playing ball. Ball playing monsters? I would play that all day. And do you want to have lunch? And that's when they realized it didn't matter how different they were because they were a lot alike, too. They both liked lunch, they both liked reading, they both had hair, they both had feet, they both had eyes and skin and teeth, but mostly they both liked each other, which is why they were best friends forever. The end.
The Reading Rockets Meet the Author series is a production of WETA. Major funding for Reading Rockets comes from the United States Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. For more author interviews, recommended reading lists, and information about teaching kids to read, please visit us online at www.readingrockets.org.